Welcome. Before we uncover what truly happened behind the grand beauty of Grant's farm in St. Louis, let me ask you, where are you watching from right now? And if you enjoy deep, true history mysteries like this, make sure to subscribe, because stories like this require serious research, digging through old records, forgotten accounts, and details history tried to keep hidden. What looks like a peaceful family estate today once carried whispers, secrets, and moments so disturbing that even those closest to the Busch family avoided speaking about them. Tonight, we're stepping beyond the postcard image to uncover the terrifying secrets said to be buried inside the Busch family mansion. The story of the Busch family and Grant's farm begins long before it became a beloved landmark in St. Louis. It starts with ambition, power, and a carefully constructed public image that hid far more than it revealed. In the mid-19th century, the Busch name was not yet synonymous with wealth or legacy. Adolphus Busch arrived in America as an immigrant, carrying little more than determination and an instinct for opportunity. Through brewing, business alliances, and relentless expansion, he built what would eventually become one of the most powerful beer empires in American history. But with that rise came pressure to maintain control, to protect reputation, and to keep certain truths buried beneath success. Grant's farm, originally known as White Haven, already carried historical weight before the Busch family acquired it. The property had been home to Ulysses S. Grant before the Civil War, a fact later used to add prestige and patriotic symbolism to the land. When the Busch family took control, they didn't just buy a farm, they inherited a symbol, and symbols, especially powerful ones, must be carefully managed. The estate became both a private retreat and a carefully curated extension of the Busch family's image refinement, tradition, stability. But behind the gates, the reality was far more complex. As the Busch fortune grew, so did the size and secrecy of the estate. New buildings were added, old structures modified or quietly removed. Records of construction were vague, incomplete, or missing entirely. Workers were hired under strict conditions, often sworn to silence about what they saw. Some were brought in temporarily, paid well, and dismissed just as quickly. Former employees later hinted that certain areas of the property were off limits, even to senior staff, and that questions were not tolerated. The mansion itself, elegant and imposing, was designed not only for comfort but for control. Long corridors, heavy doors, rooms with limited access, and spaces that seemed deliberately isolated. The Busch family was deeply aware of how quickly rumors could damage a legacy. In an era when industrial magnates were both admired and resented, any hint of scandal could spread like wildfire. So Grant's farm became a place where problems were handled quietly, far from public eyes. Illnesses were treated on the property. Disputes were settled internally. Guests who overstayed their welcome were asked to leave without explanation. And incidents that might raise questions were never documented in newspapers or official records. What the public saw was charity, hospitality, and celebration. What happened privately stayed locked behind gates and guarded conversations. There were whispers, even in those early years. Locals spoke of sudden departures, workers who left in the night and never returned to nearby towns. Neighbors noticed strange activity after dark. Lanterns moving across the grounds long after everyone should have been asleep. Carriages arriving without announcement. Rooms in the mansion lit for days, while the rest of the estate remained silent. These details never made headlines, but they lived on in quiet talk, passed from one generation to the next. What made the Busch family different from other wealthy families of the era was their absolute control over narrative. They understood that history favors those who write it. Grant's Farm was promoted as a place of heritage and beauty, a living monument to American progress. Over time, public tours and curated stories reinforced that image. Yet certain chapters were always skipped. Certain years blurred together with no explanation. Certain individuals mentioned in early documents simply vanished from later accounts. Their names never spoken again. The rise of the Busch family wasn't just financial, it was psychological. Power creates isolation. The higher they climbed, the more separated they became from ordinary scrutiny. Grant's Farm became a sanctuary, but also a barrier between the family and the outside world. Inside that barrier, decisions were made without witnesses, consequences without accountability. And while nothing overtly criminal was ever proven, the absence of evidence itself became part of the mystery. Historians have long noted gaps in personal letters, missing estate logs, and altered timelines that suggest deliberate omission rather than coincidence. By the time Grant's Farm became widely known to the public, its darker origins had already been buried under layers of curated memory. What visitors see today is a peaceful estate filled with history, animals, and celebration. But beneath that surface lies the story of a family that rose rapidly, guarded its image fiercely, and left behind unanswered questions that still echo through the property. The rise of the Busch family and their acquisition of Grant's Farm wasn't just the beginning of a legacy. It was the start of a silence that has never truly been broken. As the Busch family settled into Grant's Farm, the estate quickly gained a reputation that went far beyond wealth and elegance. From the outside, everything appeared controlled and refined, but inside the walls, there were stories that never found their way into official history. These weren't tales written down in ledgers or mentioned in polite conversation. They existed in glances, in lowered voices, and in the way longtime workers avoided certain rooms without being told to. From the earliest years of Busch ownership, there were areas of the property that people learned not to ask about. Doors stayed locked, wings of the mansion remained unused for long stretches, and entire sections of the estate were quietly altered or sealed off without explanation. Workers who were hired to maintain the mansion often noticed that the house felt uneven, as if it had been expanded in layers rather than designed as a single structure. Hallways ended abruptly. Staircases led to doors that opened into nothing more than storage or blank walls. Some claimed these were remnants of older renovations, but others believed they were intentional, designed to confuse, to hide, or to isolate certain spaces from the rest of the house. One former groundskeeper later said that when repairs were ordered in specific rooms, they were always done at night and under supervision, with strict instructions not to touch anything beyond what was assigned. There were also the guests. Grant's Farm hosted influential figures, politicians, business partners, military officers, and social elites. Many left praising the hospitality, but a few accounts suggested not everyone's stay was comfortable. Some visitors departed earlier than expected, giving vague excuses. Others were never mentioned again in correspondence, even though records showed they had been invited for extended visits. Local rumor claimed that disagreements, scandals, or illnesses were handled quietly within the estate, far from public view. Grant's farm wasn't just a home. It was a controlled environment where problems could disappear without explanation. The servants noticed patterns. Certain rooms were prepared repeatedly but rarely occupied. Beds were made, fireplaces lit, and then left untouched for days. On some nights, lights burned in parts of the mansion long after everyone else had retired. Those who passed by swore they heard movement, footsteps, murmured voices, even crying, but were warned never to investigate. The message was clear: curiosity was not welcome. Employment at Grant's farm came with good pay and stability, but also an unspoken agreement that silence was part of the job. One of the most persistent rumors involved a series of incidents that were never formally recorded. Workers spoke of sudden illnesses among guests or staff that required immediate isolation. Doctors were summoned privately, sometimes arriving after midnight, entering through side doors rather than the main entrance. In a few cases, individuals were said to have been removed from the property under heavy supervision, their belongings left behind and later burned. No death certificates, no public funerals, just absence. Officially, nothing happened. Unofficially, everyone noticed. The Busch family was meticulous about documentation, which makes the gaps in estate records especially unsettling. There are periods where maintenance logs stop abruptly. Correspondence skips months at a time. Names appear once and are never referenced again. Historians who later reviewed these materials noted that such omissions were unlikely to be accidental. In an era obsessed with record-keeping, missing information often meant something had been deliberately removed. Whether to protect reputations, avoid scandal, or conceal something more disturbing, the result was the same: a fragmented history that raised more questions than it answered. Locals living near Grant's farm added their own layers to the mystery. They spoke of carriages arriving late at night, of wagons leaving the property under guard, and of burial sites that were rumored to exist, but never officially acknowledged. Some believed the land itself carried secrets older than the Busch family, and that those secrets resurfaced once the estate became a place of power and isolation. Others felt the mansion simply became a place where human problems, greed, fear, control, were intensified and hidden rather than resolved. What makes these unspoken events so haunting is not what can be proven, but what cannot. There are no clear records of crimes, no undeniable evidence of wrongdoing. Instead, there is silence, consistent, deliberate, and enduring. The Busch family successfully shaped the public story of Grant's farm as a place of heritage and pride. But beneath that polished image lies a shadow history built from omissions, rumors, and the testimonies of people who had nothing to gain from lying. Over time, those stories hardened into legend. Rooms that no longer exist, corridors that were sealed without explanation, events that were never acknowledged. Whether these secrets were tragic, scandalous, or simply inconvenient, they were hidden with care. And that careful silence is what continues to fuel speculation today. Because when a place has so many locked doors in its past, people can't help but wonder what was kept behind them, and why no one ever wanted those doors opened again. As Grant's farm grew into a symbol of wealth and prestige, it also became a place where people from very different walks of life crossed paths: elite guests, influential visitors, and the workers who quietly kept the estate running. It was often these workers and occasional overnight guests who carried the most unsettling stories away with them. They didn't speak openly at first. Many waited years, sometimes decades, before sharing what they had seen or felt inside the Busch family mansion. And when they did, their accounts shared an eerie consistency that was hard to dismiss. Several longtime employees described an atmosphere inside the mansion that felt heavy, especially after sunset. Even during lively gatherings, there were areas of the house where sound seemed to die unnaturally, as if the walls absorbed noise. Some workers claimed they felt watched while cleaning certain rooms, even when they were alone. One maid later recalled that whenever she entered a particular guest chamber on the upper floor, she felt sudden dizziness and an overwhelming urge to leave, as though she didn't belong there. She said mirrors in that room were always covered, and no one ever explained why. Guests, too, reported strange discomfort. While many praised the estate publicly, private letters and diaries from the late 19th and early 20th centuries hint at unease. A visiting businessman wrote to his wife that Grant's farm was beautiful by day and unsettling by night, noting that he slept poorly despite luxurious accommodations. He mentioned hearing footsteps pacing outside his door, long after the household had retired, but when he opened it, the hallway was empty. Another guest claimed the temperature in certain rooms dropped dramatically without reason, even in summer. Some of the most disturbing accounts came from stable hands and night watchmen. They spoke of seeing lights move through the mansion when no one was scheduled to be awake, sometimes drifting from room to room instead of switching on and off normally. One watchman said he once saw a silhouette standing at the end of a corridor, perfectly still. Thinking it was a family member or guest, he called out, but the figure vanished before he could take a second step. After that night, he refused to patrol the interior halls and was reassigned to the outer grounds. There were also repeated stories of rooms that no one wanted to stay in more than once. Guests who were assigned those rooms often requested changes the next morning, citing vague reasons, bad dreams, headaches, or a feeling of panic that set in without warning. Staff learned to recognize the signs. When someone asked to be moved, they did it without question. The unspoken understanding was that certain spaces in the mansion were better left unused, even if no official explanation existed. A particularly unsettling rumor involved a dining room that was rarely open to guests. Workers claimed when it was used, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. Conversations dropped, laughter faded, and meals ended quickly. One former servant said she once heard crying coming from behind one of the walls during a formal dinner. When she told her supervisor, she was sharply warned never to repeat what she had heard. The wall was later renovated, and whatever had been behind it was sealed away permanently. What makes these accounts especially chilling is how controlled the responses always were. No one panicked. No one called for outside help. Instead, issues were quietly resolved, witnesses reassigned, rooms locked, and conversations ended. The Busch family and their estate managers acted as though they were accustomed to these disturbances, as if they had long accepted that some things at Grant's farm could not be explained, only managed. Over time, these experiences shaped how workers behaved. New employees were warned indirectly, told which corridors to avoid, which doors not to open, which shifts to decline if possible. Guests who stayed longer than planned were gently encouraged to leave early if they appeared unsettled. No one ever said why. The silence itself became part of the culture of the estate. By the early 20th century, the most unsettling stories were no longer discussed openly at all. They became fragmented memories, half-spoken warnings, and uneasy feelings passed down among families who had once worked there. Yet, despite the lack of written proof, the consistency of these accounts suggests something deeply disturbing lingered within the mansion's walls. Not a single dramatic incident, but a collection of moments, glances, sounds, sensations that together painted a picture of a place that never fully rested. Even today, when people visit Grant's farm and admire its beauty, some report an unexplainable discomfort in certain areas. They can't point to anything specific, but they feel it, a pressure, a chill, a sense of intrusion. And that is perhaps the most terrifying part of all, because whatever disturbed workers and guests generations ago was never confronted, never explained, and never fully erased. It was simply absorbed into the silence of the estate, waiting quietly beneath the surface, where history chose not to look. As time passed, the stories surrounding Grant's farm grew darker, shifting from unease and whispered discomfort into accounts of real tragedy. These were not the kinds of events that made newspapers or official records. Instead, they lived in fragmented memories, family stories, and private recollections of those who had reason to stay quiet. Deaths, accidents, and unexplained incidents seemed to cluster around the estate in ways that felt more than coincidental, especially to those who lived and worked nearby. One of the earliest tragedies tied to the property involved a senior caretaker who had worked at the estate for years. He was known as reliable, calm, and deeply familiar with every corner of the mansion. One winter morning, he was found at the bottom of a staircase leading to a restricted wing of the house. Officially, it was ruled an accident, a slip in poor lighting. But other workers whispered that the lights in that corridor had always worked perfectly and that the caretaker had avoided that wing for years. What unsettled them most was the position of his body. According to those who saw it before authorities arrived, he looked less like someone who fell and more like someone who had collapsed suddenly, his face frozen in shock. There were also reports of sudden illnesses that struck without warning. Guests who arrived healthy would fall violently ill within days, sometimes overnight. Doctors were summoned discreetly, often after dark, and patients were treated inside the mansion rather than moved to hospitals. In several cases, those guests were never seen again on the property. Their departures were quiet, their names never mentioned in later correspondence. While no official deaths were recorded at Grant's farm during those stays, families later spoke of relatives who returned home changed, withdrawn, or in failing health, refusing to discuss what had happened. The grounds themselves were also linked to tragedy. Stable workers spoke of fatal accidents involving horses that suddenly panicked for no clear reason. A young handler was crushed against a stall wall when a normally calm animal bolted violently, eyes wide with terror. Another worker drowned in a shallow pond on the property, a place locals said was too still, even on windy days. Those who retrieved the body claimed the man's expression was peaceful, almost resigned, as though he had seen something just before he died. What made these deaths especially disturbing was how quickly they were absorbed into silence. Investigations were brief. Families were compensated quietly. Staff were reshuffled or dismissed with generous severance, but strict instructions not to speak publicly. There were no lawsuits, no public disputes, no lingering questions, at least not officially. To outsiders, these were unfortunate but ordinary incidents. To those inside the estate, they felt like part of a pattern. Some believed the land itself was responsible. Long before the Busch family, the property had changed hands multiple times and carried its own heavy history. Locals claimed the soil held memories of hardship, loss, and unresolved suffering. Whether superstition or something deeper, people working at Grant's farm often spoke of feeling drained after long shifts, as though the place took something from them. Night workers, in particular, complained of headaches, disorientation, and vivid nightmares that stopped once they left the job. There were also rumors of deaths that never reached any authority at all. Stories of unnamed laborers who disappeared, of temporary workers who arrived and were never seen again in surrounding towns. No proof ever surfaced, but the lack of records only fueled speculation. In an era when wealthy families could control information with ease, it was entirely possible for certain events to vanish completely from public awareness. Even members of the Busch family were not untouched by tragedy. Sudden losses, personal struggles, and emotional breakdowns were quietly managed within the estate. Some historians suggest that Grant's farm functioned as both refuge and prison, a place where problems were contained, but also intensified by isolation. When tragedy struck, it struck behind closed doors, where grief and fear had nowhere to escape. By the early 20th century, the reputation of Grant's farm among locals was firmly established. People avoided the area at night. Parents warned children not to wander near the gates. Carriages and later automobiles passed more quickly when moving by the estate, as if lingering too long invited misfortune. These beliefs were never written down, never acknowledged officially, but they persisted with remarkable consistency. What remains most chilling is not the number of tragedies, but how neatly they were hidden. No mass graves, no public scandals, no dramatic confessions. Just a trail of accidents, illnesses, and disappearances that blended into history without leaving clear fingerprints. And that is why Grant's farm continues to unsettle those who look too closely. Because when death visits a place repeatedly and leaves no record behind, it raises a question that refuses to fade. Were these tragedies truly random? Or was there something about the mansion, the land, or the secrets it held that made suffering inevitable? Even now, long after the estate became a place of public visits and cheerful narratives, those older stories linger beneath the surface. They survive in the discomfort people feel in certain corners, in the way guides avoid specific details, and in the quiet understanding that not everything that happened at Grant's farm was meant to be remembered. Some tragedies were never mourned publicly. Some deaths were never fully explained. And those unanswered questions continue to haunt the legacy of the Busch family mansion, casting a shadow that history has never fully been able to erase. What makes Grant's farm truly unsettling is not just what people claim happened there, but how carefully so much of it was never written down. The absence of records is itself a kind of evidence, pointing toward deliberate silence rather than simple loss. In an era when wealthy families controlled newspapers, local officials, and even church leaders, it was entirely possible to erase uncomfortable truths before they ever reached ink and paper. At Grant's farm, this erasure became almost systematic, turning the mansion into a place where events occurred, consequences followed, and yet history remained blank. Former clerks and assistants who worked for the Busch family later hinted that certain journals and ledgers were kept separate from official records. These private books tracked matters that were not for public knowledge, including disputes, payments, and incidents that required immediate resolution. None of these documents have ever surfaced. Some historians believe they were destroyed intentionally, while others suggest they were locked away in private collections that remain inaccessible to researchers. Either way, their absence leaves large gaps in the timeline of the estate, especially during periods when multiple troubling events were rumored to have occurred close together. Deaths, in particular, were handled with extraordinary discretion. If someone died on or near the property, the location was often recorded differently, sometimes miles away, to avoid associating the estate with the incident. Causes of death were simplified or vaguely described. Sudden illness or unfortunate accident became catch-all explanations that prevented further questioning. In some cases, no death certificate was issued locally at all. Instead, arrangements were made elsewhere, leaving no trace in county records connected to Grant's farm. Workers who witnessed disturbing events understood quickly that speaking openly was dangerous, not necessarily because of threats, but because of consequences. Jobs disappeared. Housing arrangements changed. References were quietly denied. In tight-knit communities, this kind of pressure was more effective than force. People learned to forget, or at least to pretend they had. Over time, first-hand accounts faded, replaced by rumors that grew more distorted with each retelling, making it easier for skeptics to dismiss them as superstition. The Busch family's public image also played a critical role in keeping secrets buried. Known for philanthropy, business success, and civic contributions, they were widely respected. Challenging their narrative required proof that no one seemed able to produce. Journalists who attempted to dig deeper found doors closed politely but firmly. Editors declined stories that could damage a respected family. In such an environment, silence was not suspicious, it was expected. Church records, often a secondary source for historians, also offer surprisingly little detail regarding certain periods at Grant's farm. Baptisms, burials, and pastoral visits appear irregular or incomplete. Some entries are missing entirely. Given how meticulously churches typically documented their activities, these gaps stand out. It suggests cooperation, whether willing or pressured, in keeping certain events unacknowledged even in spiritual records, meant to outlast generations. Another reason many secrets were never recorded lies in how incidents were framed at the time. What we might now consider suspicious or traumatic was often dismissed as unfortunate but normal. Dangerous working conditions, untreated illnesses, and sudden deaths were common in the 19th century. By blending extraordinary events into ordinary hardship, the truth became harder to isolate. When something truly strange happened, it could be buried beneath the assumption that life was simply cruel and unpredictable. There is also the possibility that some secrets were never written down because those involved feared putting them into words. Writing makes things permanent. It gives them a life beyond the moment. For people who believed the estate carried a kind of darkness, committing those experiences to paper may have felt like inviting that darkness to follow them. Oral warnings, quiet advice to avoid certain rooms, to leave before nightfall, to never ask questions, were safer than documentation. Even today, Historians face resistance when attempting to access private family archives related to Grant's farm. Portions remain sealed, while others are selectively available. This controlled access shapes the narrative that survives. What is shown reinforces the image of prosperity and innovation. What is hidden remains hidden for a reason. Silence, after all, does not require maintenance. It simply requires that no one break it. The most unsettling aspect is that the lack of records creates a space where imagination and reality blur. Without documents, we cannot definitively prove or disprove many of the claims surrounding the estate. That uncertainty allows the stories to persist. They survive not because they are sensational, but because nothing has conclusively replaced them. Where facts end, unease begins. Grant's farm stands today as a place of curated history, carefully presented and warmly explained. But beneath that surface lies an absence that speaks loudly to those who know how to listen. Secrets do not always announce themselves through dramatic revelations or lost manuscripts. Sometimes they reveal themselves through what is missing. The reports never filed, the names never recorded, the questions never answered. And that is why Keynote 5 matters more than any single tragedy or rumor. Because when history is silent where it should be detailed, that silence becomes its own testimony. At Grant's farm, the most terrifying secrets may not be the stories people tell, but the ones history was never allowed to write.